So we get before the movie, we get the sitting in the audience messages we need to throw in some trivia questions,
That's right.
Be like real movie experience.
I can't tell that it's actually, that's weird. From this view that I have, I can't tell that it's actually presenting. Glad it is.
Yeah, it's presenting. I think the trivia question should be who wants to sponsor, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Somebody could put some cool slide effects in there. I don't know who did that, but
This
fancy.
is Tim's creation. He took all the power of his turn to host. Is there a setting for all the animations? Seems like it's just cycling through random animations.
Yeah, this is Keynote, so I was just trying a couple different.
Oh, I didn't know if you programmed it specifically or it was just picking random animations.
No, I just was playing around, just kind of see. I never use, like, it's been forever since I've had to do a presentation, so
yeah,
I was just seeing what was new.
So monthly sponsor is sponsor?
At the moment, we don't have one. We're still getting back in the routine. Cool. It's so secret. You have to be on the invite list to know who the sponsor is.
Awesome. Well, they're getting their money's worth then.
Yeah.
Click here to consent, right?
Right.
So are you guys going to have your user group or your code camp the same time next year? Or are you guys trying to do it this fall?
I think it takes a while to organize, so we'll probably aim for same time, not same time next year, but we usually do it in March. So we want to kind of aim for that if possible. If our venue is willing to let us host, we'll do it then. So the thing is, the venue is it's a state college, so
yeah,
they have their own set of rules and regulations. So we'll see what they say.
Yep, I totally know what that's all about. So, yep. I know Joe G is waiting for the community college by him that he has the desert code camp at every year. Yeah, so he's waiting on them to make a decision.
Yeah, and it helps having the local community colleges help us, because that way we don't have to pay for a venue or something like that. So it's a really good partnership.
Yeah, and it was if it's a place that I think I was there a few years ago. If it was the same place, it was a good facility location.
Yeah, it's the same place. We've done it there for what now? 10 years or something. So yeah, I think we all are a little bit burnt out by when we had to cancel the code camp, because we were supposed to hold it in March of 2020, and of course,
Oh yeah. Well, at least you didn't have to pay like a cancellation fee and all that, like some of the bigger regional events have to.
Yeah, I think that really helped. It was actually fantastic, because the people we ordered food from, the people we actually had hotel arrangements with, everyone allowed cancellations.
Oh, that's
So,
nice.
yeah. Because I think the deal we had with the hotel people, Westin, I think Westin was the company or the hotel chain we had an agreement with, but we were supposed to like book a minimum of 20 rooms, otherwise we'd have to pay the remainder out of pocket. This is so people can get good rates at that Westin, right? So,
Mhm.
you know, we went to them and said, you know, look, no one is coming. What do you want us to do? They said, that's fine, we'll just cancel it. So that was really cool of them to do that.
Yeah, that was.
I was afraid that we'd have to end up footing that bill. That would have been massive.
Yep.
Especially for a small code camp like us.
This might
Still seeing
be,
folks join here. Should we give them a couple more minutes before we kick things off?
It's your show, Tim. You decide.
We'll wait a couple minutes then. Andy, I think you were saying there's quite a number of folks that had RSVP'd between the
Yeah, there was
meetup and
close to 200, I think, between our list and the .NET Foundation repost.
wow.
Now, granted, with every user group, not everybody, you know, can show
Yeah.
up or
And
you
especially virtual, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's about
you get a
10%.
you get a percentage, right? It's
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not even that high of a percentage.
Yeah.
It's usually like 10 to 20%.
all right. Well, why don't we get started and folks can catch up if they want. So welcome everyone to the Orlando.NET user group. Today's meeting is being recorded on 7/15/2021. Our featured presenter is Chris Woodruff, and he's going to be talking about developing great web API architectures with ASP.NET 5. Just a couple of quick reminders. This meeting is being recorded, so your continued participation in the meeting is your consent to be recorded. A couple of quick reminders and housekeeping items. We ask that everyone goes on mute when you're not asking a question. And then if you like, consider turning off your camera too during the presentation, just to help folks who are watching later on, maybe from being less distracted. The OneTug is made up of, or is organized by these fine members here. A couple of resources. You can find us online, onetug.net. We're probably more active on Meetup and on Twitter. And if you haven't already done so, we encourage you to go out to YouTube and subscribe to our channel, onetug.net/YouTube, to get to there. There you can find past recordings, and you'll find a rerun of this recording tonight as well. Upcoming meetings, July 27th, Sean Colleen will be doing an introduction to the actor model in Akka.net. And then August 12th, Siva Kumar is talking about GitOps with Flux v2 and Flagler. There's no monthly sponsor this week or this month, but if you are interested in sponsoring, shoot us an email at board@onetug.net. And if anyone has any community announcements, any job postings, if you're looking for work, any upcoming meetings or conferences that you want to pitch, or feel free to come off of mute and let us know.
I have something. So Rocket Mortgage is always hiring. So we have needs for .NET, JavaScript, TypeScript, Angular, React, iOS, Android, Python, AWS. So if you have any of those skills, and we are fully remote now, we're remote first. So you can live in sunny Florida all winter and not have to move to Detroit. So it's a win. So yeah, just get a hold of me or ping me, get the information from anyone here, and they can connect you with me.
Excellent. Anyone else have anything else to to pitch?
Hey, Tim. Yeah, I do. This is Todd.
Yes.
I have, I'm going to post a link in the chat. We have some openings also, but I'll post a link in the chat.
Okay, awesome.
Chris, even if you want to post a link in the chat, I think that would be useful for those who want to get in touch with you.
Sure.
All right, we're partway through tonight's agenda, so done the welcome and announcements. Reminder that we're recording and we'll be presenting this on YouTube later on. And our featured speaker again is Chris Woodruff. He's talking about developing great web API architectures with ASP.NET 5. Just a little bit about Chris. So he's the team leader of developer relations at Quicken Loans, the nation's largest mortgage lender based in Detroit. He's got over 25 years of experience when he started before the first .com boom. Chris has spoken at many events worldwide covering software development, architecture topics such as database development, APIs, and web development. He's a proven mentor who enjoys helping, educating, and supporting other developers to gain knowledge through speaking, writing, and online content. When not working or spending time with his family, you can find Woody traveling down the Bourbon Trail to find new bottles to share with friends. You can read more about Woody on his blog at chriswoodruff.com and follow him on the various social media outlets here. So without that, or without any further comments from me, we'll kick it off to Chris to go and get started.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see. Let me know if you can see my screen. Is everything good?
We can, yep.
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay. And there. Okay, so well, one, I really appreciate everyone having me for this user group meeting. It's a little cooler up here in Michigan. I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I think it's only, let me check. I'll make you guys feel bad. It's only 73 degrees here. So it's been kind of on the cooler side the last few days. So, but we're going to talk about something that's really hot. So we're going to talk about architecture for your web APIs. And we're going to be using ASP.NET for this. The code I'm using for this demo, which you can grab out on GitHub, which I'll post at the end, is using ASP.NET 5. But really the concepts that I am talking about here can be used for anything. It can be used even for ASP.NET and .NET Framework, if you go back to 4.8. But some of the stuff can't, like when I talk about dependency injection. But a lot of the bigger concepts and patterns can be used in other places and even in other languages like JavaScript and stuff like that. So let's move on. So, okay. So just give you my email. If you do want to get a hold of me, it's just chriswoodruff@quickenloans.com. And then my Twitter is just C Woodruff. You can usually find me anywhere with C Woodruff. So it's kind of boring, but that's kind of the handle I go by on social media and the internet. So, you know, I've been doing API development for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. And I did a lot of things wrong. So we're going to talk about what I did wrong and maybe some of the things that you did wrong and how I can share. So the agenda is we're going to talk about some bad habits and then talk about some good habits and some good patterns. And please, if anyone wants to ask questions, you can interrupt me. Sometimes I don't even like to hear myself talk for 45 to 60 minutes. So I don't know how anyone would want to just hear me drone on and on for that long. So please interrupt me, ask your questions. If I'll ask the guys if anyone puts questions in the chat, if they can interrupt me and then ask me those questions. That way I can answer those when they come up. So let's dig into some bad habits. So the first bad habit really comes from this copying Microsoft demos. So if you've ever seen Microsoft demos for new technologies, and when they put stuff out on MSDN or they put stuff out on GitHub, you know what? A lot of that stuff is really good from a initial understanding of the framework or some new way of developing something or some new feature in .NET, but it's not that great for production. So one thing is having all of your code, meaning your domain knowledge, validation, data access. If you put all that in your controllers, it gets really messy. You can't test it, so it's not really testable, and it's just hard to have all that code together. It's something that we try to decouple, and so I would ask that you don't put all of your code into your controller actions. So it's actually better to kind of spread your code out and put it in kind of isolated areas that can be tested in isolation. And as you can see, it makes the code a lot simpler. You'll probably look at my source code and my demo code and go, man, that's not very much code that he's showing us. Well, it's not, but if you put it all into the controller actions, it would be a lot of complex code. So another bad habit that I used to do, and I think people that probably have been around for a few decades, is putting all of your code in one project. It's the old spaghetti code pattern or anti-pattern. Just don't do that. For me, I try to spread my stuff out and put it into projects and areas in my solutions that I can reuse. So we'll go through this, and I actually can reuse part of this architecture, part of this solution that I'm showing you in other places. So I could take out my domain project and put it into a ASP.NET MVC app or a Blazor app, and it would just work. So by not having all of your code in a single project, it allows you to reuse it easier. And again, it's easier to test. So another thing that I used to do is kind of put my data access code in with my domain, like my business logic and my validation. It's good to decouple those for the same reason as I talked before. You're isolating your data or your code in different places. They each do their own thing, and they don't really need to know about the other. So it's just better. Plus, again, testing is much easier. And you know what? This bad habit kind of isn't around as much, or I hope it's not around as much as it used to be 10, 20 years ago. But I can say that in the last 6, 7, 8 years, our community has gotten much better with testing, especially unit testing. And then I'll talk about this new way of testing. It's called integration testing. It came out with .NET and ASP.NET Core. And if we have enough time, I'll demo that and show you what that's all about. But there are two different ways of testing. Most people know about unit testing, but we'll take a look at integration testing if we can. So at this point, I'm usually in front of a big room, in front of people, and I want people to talk. So I always ask people what they like about ASP.NET Core. I've started this talk way back a few years ago when ASP.NET Core came out. But I mean, if people want to jump in, I would love to hear what people like about ASP.NET Core and ASP.NET 5. Yep, Kelly says dependency injection. Awesome. Built in. Yep, it is built in. That was one thing I hated in the old ASP.NET days, in the .NET framework days, when we didn't have dependency injection built into the foundation, into the framework itself. Was, if I came behind someone and they built in Inject or some other library that did dependency injection, it was hard to read sometimes. It was hard to understand. You had to kind of there weren't even dots to connect. It was actually kind of, okay, something's going down the rabbit hole here and it's coming up here, and you kind of have to kind of look and investigate and figure out how to connect those. But with a common dependency injection for that, it is really easy to use dependency injection in ASP.NET 5 and even Core 3.1 and stuff. So another thing that I like about the new .NET and ASP.NET is they're open source, so you can go out and take a look if you want to fix a bug. Microsoft, if they want to take it, will take it, and they'll even give you credit for it as a contributor. Another thing is they built it from the ground up, and so it is extremely performant compared to .NET Framework. And I see someone said they do a modular pipeline approach. Yes, and it's interesting. You can actually get into that pipeline and see things even before they go into the routing logic for ASP.NET. I have a little bit of code that's commented out in this demo where I grab everything before it even comes into my routing code behind the scenes, and I can check to see stuff, and I can reject it at that point. So yes, there is a lot of pipeline that you can get into, and cross-platform. Great. That, you know what, that is very true. The days of running everything on Windows is over. I have a Linux laptop that actually I like to code on Linux, sometimes even more than Windows. So I use Ubuntu, and I use Rider. So I use a IDE for my development that looks the same on pretty much all three operating systems. You get the same thing if you're using VS Code. But yeah, so those are some of the great things that we have with the new ASP.NET Core and 5. So before we get into building our architectures for Web API, I have to stress to understand HTTP. It's an important protocol for the internet. So if you actually build stuff and build APIs or even consume APIs, understanding some of the basics around HTTP, like a response body or request body, request headers, request verbs, response bodies, response headers, and response codes. If you understand those, you will understand the language of your APIs a lot better. As an example, a 200 means success, and you should get something back from your API endpoint that you called. Well, what's a 204? A 204 means it's also successful, but you will not get anything in the response body. So just by understanding the difference between a 200 and a 204 in your consuming application, you can not even go and check the response body, because there shouldn't be anything in there, because it is a 204, and that is the definition of a 204 response code. So understand the HTTP protocol. I actually do a talk, a whole hour talk on just understanding the protocol of HTTP, and I find it fascinating. So I build my APIs with a architecture that's kind of represented by this picture. So I have my API up top. It has my endpoints. I have my domain. It has all of my business logic, and it does my validation. And it also holds all the information for my other parts of my application. So it holds all my models, my entity models, and what I call my API models, and we'll look at those in a little bit. It holds all my interfaces. So it's kind of like a place where all the information of my architecture lives in. Then I have my data. So I can have multiple data projects, and I'll show you how I do that. And then tests. So tests are as important in my architecture as any other piece. If I took tests away, this whole architecture would fall apart, because you have to test your stuff to make sure that it works. It works on the inside, and it works from the outside. Yeah, Todd, we'll talk about bourbon at the end. So I love that. So interesting. I haven't been to some of those distilleries before. So I'm going to go out and take a look at my project. So as you can see, I have a number of projects underneath the solution. So I'm using for this demo a database called Chinook. And Chinook is a old, well, not super old, but it's probably about 10 years old by now. But it's a database that simulates a online music store. And so I like it better than Northwind and AdventureWorks, because it has music data in it, and it's a little more interesting than widgets and bicycle parts to me. As you can see over here on the right-hand side of the screen, in Rider, I do have the database schema is loaded in, so I can actually see the schema as I am developing my application. So one cool thing I like about Rider is I can have all the information about the database I'm working against right in the same IDE. But so I use Chinook. You can find Chinook out on one of my repositories. Microsoft used to do it in the old open source site. I forgot what it's called, but it's been down for years. But I grabbed all that stuff and I put it into a repo, and it's still out on GitHub. So I'm glad yep, Codeplex. Thanks, Andy. And then we have we have 4 data projects, one for Dapper, one for EF Core, one for JSON, which is kind of SQL JSON, and then a mock data project. So these are around. I can use any of these in my project, and I'll show how we do that. I have my domain. I talked about my domain. It contains all of the information about my web API. It contains the domain knowledge of my web API. And then I have 2 projects, one around integration tests and unit tests. Now, if I ran this, actually, I gave a talk last night in Dallas, and I never ran my project. I just talked and showed code. But here is what you get when you run this. I use Swagger. I have a lot of it defined in different ways, so I can kind of have my own information. But like if I wanted to go out and get all albums, it's easy to do that. And you can see there's all my albums coming back. So Swagger's pretty cool. There's my Swagger document. So you can see, you can grab this Swagger document. You can generate some client code based on this document, and you can be off and running against this API if you wanted to. Okay, so I ran it, showed you that it actually works. So let's take a look at the startup. So few different things. I have some things in a configuration, in some configuration files, but some things I don't. So I do have some of the API behavior options. I do have caching set up, so we can actually go in here and take a look. For all of my data repositories, I have those in this method. They will add those, each repository for each one of my entity types, and those will be put into the dependency injection pool. And how I decide which one I want to use is by the using directive. So in this case, I'm using my EF core data repositories, but I also have two other using directives out here that I have commented out, one for the SQL JSON and one for Dapper. If I wanted to use Dapper, all I would have to do is uncomment the Dapper, comment out the EF core, and it will put the Dapper data repositories into dependency injection, because I use interfaces for all of those data repositories. So all of the data repositories have the same interfaces. They have different implementations for the data access, but they all share the same contract. So I can swap all those data repositories in and out depending on what I need. So in this architecture, I like it because I can just start swapping out. I can add new data projects if I want, and I can kind of test those out and see which ones run faster for me, and then I can move on. They don't affect any changes in any other places in my endpoints or in my domain, because those don't care how the data comes in and out of the database. So I also have this supervisor, which we'll look at in the domain. I do have that. If you guys remember, I have this little add middleware. It's commented out, but I do have this thing where I can dig into some middleware stuff and catch those requests coming in before it gets into my routing. I have logging set up. I have caching set up. So for this project, I have two types of caching that I've initialized. I'm doing in-memory caching, and I'm also doing response caching. So we'll talk about those towards the end also, and what the importance of caching in your web API is. I have cores, and then I have been experimenting with this with API Explorer services, but I haven't really dug into them too much. And then the last one is versioning. So API versioning has always been kind of hard with .NET or ASP.NET 5. They have kind of given a easy way to do versioning, or at least it's easier. It's never easy to do versioning, but when we get into the controllers, I will show you how you do versioning. So in the services, in the startup, you just have to say what the major version and the minor version of your current version is, and then you annotate your controllers and your actions, and Microsoft the application will only use those actions for your routing. So it's actually kind of cool. So so let's go back to the presentation layer. So what is my API layer? So my API layer is a lot like my UI of a web application. So I build my web applications to be the UI to be very thin. All it really does is the presentation for my application. I don't really have a lot of business logic in my UIs. I don't really have a lot of validation if I can't help it. So it's really thin. That's how I see my API layer. My API layer accepts a HTTP request. It calls out to get some information. It either gets that information or gets an exception and sends back a appropriate HTTP response. And that's all it really does. That's all my API layer does. It interacts with the consumer of my API with what I call an API model. So API model can be exactly the same as my entity model, that in this case, maybe I'm doing EF Core and I'm using those entity models with EF Core. My API models can be exactly like those entity that were generated from EF Core, but they don't have to be. It's the beauty of my architecture is that I can modify these API models to be more complex or more simple and give me a different way of communicating through my APIs. And we'll take a look at those in a second. So let's go back out to our code. I will take a look at a controller. So let's take a look at album controller. So in this online music store, we have albums. So an album is what you know an album is, a music album. And a music album is from an artist, and it has tracks that it's associated with. So in here, as you can see, that API version. So I am telling this API version that this controller is linked to the 1.0 API version. And I can also do that at the action level too. So I could actually have two of these get, and in this case, this gets all albums. I could actually have two of these mapped to different API versions, and ASP.NET is smart enough to know which one, based on how my ASP.NET project in the startup was configured, it will know which action to route the request to. And then I have some other things. I have all my Swagger operation metadata, and then I have my produces and all that stuff. But in here, as you can see, this is all the code that I have for my get all. So I basically call my Chinook supervisor, which is kind of my object that gets all my information. Either I can get information, get data from my database, or I can send in to do posts or puts or deletes based on the action that an HTTP verb that was called. So in this case, I'm getting all my albums, and it returns back with a object result. If I do get an exception, in this case, I'm just sending back a 500 error, and I'm logging that error out into the logger. But you could catch different exceptions, like in a real production API that I have done. I send back different exceptions based on different errors coming out of the Chinook, this supervisor type of thing. I just keep it simple for these demos. But you can catch different exceptions and send back different error codes. So if I had an error for validation, I could send back a 400, some type of 400 error, which means that that if I was posting something, putting a new entity or new object into the database, I could say this entity that you send in does not meet the validation rules, and I could send that back and have a specific HTTP response code on it. But in this case, I'm getting a list of the, and you can see here, I'm actually getting a list of API models of album type. So these are not the entity, these are not the album entity framework core entity types. These are this new API model type, and we'll talk about those in a second. But really, that's all it really is. I'm not doing a whole lot in my endpoints. There's not much to them. I just go out and either send the information that needs to be put into the database or deleted, or I get the information I need out of it, and I send back a response. So there's not much to it beyond that. So yeah. Anyone have questions about my API layer or how I set things up in the startup, or just in general questions? I'll take them right now as I'm switching back. No questions. Okay, cool. So where is the validation being performed? Great question. And are you indicating APIs? Yes, it's basically the same thing as a DTO. So I just call it an API model, but that's the way I call it. Some people call them DTOs, and you can call it DTO. So where's the validation being performed? We'll talk about that. That's happening in the domain layer. So let's talk about the domain layer.
Could I ask one other question real quick?
Sure.
So that produces, what I probably should know this, but what does produces actually indicate? It seems kind of redundant in that example, but I'm sure there's
kind of redundant, but it also so produces just says it produces a type of and then list of that. It basically is I think I could probably, it's been around for a while. I might be able to remove those. I usually don't try to remove very much. So it actually might be redundant, but it is I think it's there for the compiler to know what, I mean, even though it is in the method. That's a good question. I will have to dig in. I used to know that at one point. You caught me on that. So good catch.
I definitely know the feeling. There's a lot of stuff I kind of do by habit.
So. No. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I even added this this code in here. So these attributes, these have been around for probably since ASP.NET Core 1.2 or something, if I remember right. So, but good catch, and maybe at the end I'll look them up as people are talking, and I'll share that with everyone. Okay. So let's go back to the domain layer. So what does the domain layer do? It does a lot, but but it's not super complex either. But it contains both my entity models, in this case, entity models that can be used for entity framework core. It can be used for Dapper, and it can be used for the SQL JSON model and my mock data project. So I make these entity models very generic. I try not to have too many attributes on them, too much annotation. Is that what Swagger looks at to generate the swagger.json? It might, Stephen. It actually might, but I don't know. It would be good. So I believe there is a limitation on one of the early amount of nswag that you had to set due to. So I knew it. It's been around for a while, so maybe I don't need it anymore. I'll have to take a look to see if I can remove it. So thank you guys for asking all that stuff and letting me know. So I have these entity models which represent the tables in my database, or it could represent anything. But I also have these API models, and I have those in my domain because I only want them to live in one place. I don't want my entity models to be duplicated across all of my data projects because my interfaces that are in my domain layer, and I'll flip to the next, the interfaces for the data retrieval, the data repositories, use those API models and those entity models. So I like to keep those in one place, not to have duplicate data all around. So I do keep all those interfaces in my domain project. Also, I use dependency injection. We looked at that. The dependency injection happens in the startup for the ASP.NET application, in this case, the web API application. And if you remember back in the beginning, I can inject any of the data repositories I want. I can do them for EF Core, Dapper, or JSON, and they all work as is because they adhere to those contracts in the interface. And then I have my supervisor. So my supervisor is kind of like a black box. I can send API models in, and on the other side, entity models come out so that those can be inserted or updated, or if I send an ID in, those can be deleted based on what is being sent in by the endpoints. And then the other way, when I need to get data from my database, entity models come in, those entity objects come in, and API models come out. So, and they get converted on the inside, they get validated. So that's where validation happens inside my supervisor. It's kind of the brains of my architecture, and we'll take a look at that in a second. Let's go out and take a look at that. So I'm going to collapse there. I'm going to go down to my domain, and I'm going to take a look at the entities and the API models right now. So we're going to take a look at album. Album's pretty simple. There's not much to it. If you take a look over here at my database schema, you'll see there's a ID, a title, and an artist ID. That's what is in my table. And you can see that same thing in my album entity. There's the ID, there's a title, and there's the artist ID. Now, I could get rid of, I don't really need this these attributes, because I use a different kind of validation and I'll talk about that in a second. But I do have, and I'll tell you what this JSON ignore is. For me, I usually, when I send things out, in this case, I try to keep the payloads of my response bodies as small as possible. And sometimes if you have a lot of associations and you start grabbing, like, say, give me all the albums, and I have like 2,000 albums in this database, and then each one of those brings back all the tracks in JSON and brings back the artists, that payload can get very big. By using JSON ignore, it will skip over that when these objects come back to be sent back through the endpoint. Now, sometimes you don't want those, but sometimes you do. So I'm just giving you an idea what this JSON ignore annotation means. And then down here I have a convert. So I can convert this from an entity to a album API model. And then I also have a convert async. So I have a synchronous convert and an async convert that I can do. Okay, so now I'm going to jump up and take a look at the API model for album. Now the API model for album has the exact same properties, ID, title, and artist, but it has a new one called artist name. And I see a bug in here. Shouldn't have JSON ignore because I actually want to send back this artist name back coming out of the endpoint. So that is a bug. So I just discovered that in the most unopportune time. So, but why I have these API models is so I can do something like this artist name. So say I have this album, and I don't really want to send back the whole artist object back in my response payload or my response body, but I do want to send back the artist name. Well, if I was just using entities all over the place, I couldn't add that artist name to that object, to that JSON coming back through my endpoint. So that's why I kind of have two separate models and two separate sets of entity models, because I think I want to do something like this. I want to add this artist name because for most of the time, if you get a bunch of albums, what good is an album name without the name of the artist to go with it? So it's just a natural thing. Another example is, and another system that I've written is, and you might have the same thing. I have a person table in my database, and I have another table that contains phone numbers, another table that contains addresses, and maybe emails or different information about that person. And there's different types on those. So maybe I am wanting to know what the primary address is for a person, or the work email or personal email, stuff like that. So what I can do is I can create a person entity from Entity Framework Core, which is just going to be some basic information about that person, maybe first, last name. And it just has collections and maybe associations for other data. But in my API model, I want to bring in the address, the primary address, and have that as properties in the API model for a person, or have a property for primary or like home phone number and cell phone. I have a question. Why use JSON ignore in entity? It could be done in API model. It could. So I can do it by hand. I mostly did it in here just to show that you can what it will do, and then also you can annotate and you can say not to validate anything. So you're right. I could leave out some of these JSON ignore and just not fill them in when I do my conversion. Now, the one thing is you will still get that property coming back in your JSON. So we'll have an empty JSON segment. But if you use JSON ignore, it won't even include that in the JSON itself. So it totally skips over it. So that might be a reason why you do use JSON ignore. So in here, I do have this artist name. So we have that. So that's kind of the reason why I have two different sets of model classes and things. So let's go down to repositories. So all my interfaces for my repositories are in my domain. So that way, each one of my data access projects know what those contracts are, and these are pretty simple for the most part. So I keep all those in here. And then let me close all these. The most complex part is the supervisor. Now the supervisor is one big class. I break it up into individual files because I didn't want to have all that source code in one giant file. I wanted to break it up based on the entities. But I had to use one big class and have a partial class all over the place. Anyone know why? So this is a quiz. Anyone know why I have to have one giant class instead of 12 different entity supervisor classes? Reduce DI needed for each controller. Good. Well, it's not correct, but I like your thinking, Kelly. I like that. I like the thinking, but it's not correct. It has to do with some kind of error related to a shape. I'll give you a clue. And you guys can talk. You guys can come unmute. Shared state? Nope. I'll give you a hint. An album has a reference to an artist, and an artist has a reference to multiple albums. Yes, Jonathan, circular reference. So I tried everything I could do to not have this giant monolithic class as my supervisor. I mean, I tried to figure out different ways of doing it. I talked to much smarter people than myself. If anyone knows Mark Rendell, I talked to Mark. I talked to Micah Munson. I talked to just a ton of people that know .NET and know ASP.NET, and none of us could figure out something other than using one giant supervisor class. So circular reference was the issue. So, but in here, if we go back up to the top part of this supervisor partial class, you can see that I'm getting all of my data repositories from dependency injection, and then I'm kind of associating those with some private variables or private properties in this class. And then I have my validators. So we'll take a look at those. I use a class called Fluent Validation, or Fluent Validation to do all my validation. So we'll look at that in a second. So let's take a look at the album. So I have a get all album. Basically, I'm just going out and getting all the albums from the album repository that I grabbed from the dependency injection, and I'm converting them all. I could convert them up here, but I was having an issue with around, and I'm still trying to figure this out. I've got a bug. You can see I'm doing the non-asynchronous version of my convert all. I've got a bug right now that I'm trying to figure out how to get this to work. But so, and then down here in this for each, I'm actually putting each one of those album API models into my in-memory cache. And so you can see here that I set that up for each one, and I give each one a time span for the lifetime that they're and the length of life that they have. So these are, I think that is a week in seconds. So I put this in cache. I set it in here. I have to give it some kind of unique name, and then I give it those cache entry options. So each one of these albums get put into the cache, and then I return those back out. Well, if I go to grab an individual album based on some ID, I actually check to see if that is in the cache. If it was in the cache, I send it back. If it's not, I get it out of the data repository for album. I put it into the cache, and then I send it back. And then I also down here give the artist name. I go out and just grab the artist and associate that. Don't probably need to do that because of the conversion, but that was some old source code I had. But so this isn't the perfect way to do cache, because actually you can see up here, if I'm grabbing if I call get all albums twice, I'm getting all albums from the database, and I should probably see if all the albums are in the database and then grab them out of the cache and reuse them. So my logic around caching isn't the best, but I just wanted this demo to show how to kind of use in-memory caching in your web API. And then I have some other ones. I have like get album by artist ID. So this will get all the albums for a certain artist, and it'll send it back. I can get my add, my update, my delete. So it's pretty simple, and there's not much to it. As you can see, if I would have had all this code pushed into my controller actions, those actions would have been pretty complex, and they would have been a lot more, maybe a lot more harder to work in. But by separating out that supervisor, that middleware kind of logic from my endpoint, I'm actually making these methods a lot easier to work with, and I think they're a little better to understand. Plus, I can test out each one of these in isolation. The other thing is, if you want to dig in here, I do have like all of my conversion logic. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but the last thing I want to show is my validation. So again, I'm using Fluent Validation. And what this will do is, album's not very interesting. Let's take a look at customer. So when I want to validate a customer, I have all these rules written for the customer. Now, for me, in the way I think, I kind of want to isolate as much code away from areas and have it by itself. So for me, having this validation, all this validation code isolated away from my entities makes the validation kind of work in my brain a little easier. And I think it allows me to communicate those validation rules a little easier. So in here, if someone comes in and says, oh, customer validation is first name can't be null, email is an email address, a phone matches this regex pattern. For me, it reads better and it communicates the intent of the validation a little easier. So that's why I use it, and I kind of try to use fluent validation in all of my code and try to not have as much of those annotations in my entity at the entity level. And I think you can actually unit test your validation also. You can send in mock objects into your validator and see if they validate or not. And so for me, that is kind of the next step in this code base that I'm going to be doing, is trying to write some unit tests for the validation. So that is my domain. Anyone have questions around the domain in my architecture? Oh, is supervisor referring to mediator pattern from design patterns or influence from it? Yeah, it doesn't adhere to the strict mediator pattern. It might have influenced it, but I didn't really even think about that. I was just trying to, when we were creating our first APIs around this architecture idea, we were just trying to come up with some easy ways to isolate code, but maybe it's very similar to the mediator pattern. Haven't looked at that. So where is the validation being done? So that's a good question. So it needs to be done. Let's go back. I need to code that up. So it would be done if I went back to the album. So what I should be doing is, if I come down here to like add album, you actually have to convert it or not convert it, validate it in here. So it needs to be added. I just started putting the fluent validation stuff into this code base, so it's still kind of a work in progress. But it would be done here, and it would be done at the update album level. So you can just call those and validate them as they come in, and if they don't validate, what I have done in other projects is send back an exception, a special exception that gets caught by the endpoint, so I know that the objects didn't validate correctly, and then I can send back a 400 level response code to back to the consumer of the API. Okay. Don't have a drink. Oh, that's really good. Mouth is all dried out. Okay. Apart from cores and validation, are there any other security related things I need to be aware of when building APIs? Also, where does the input validation occur? So input validation, I just showed. If I'm validating something that needs to be inserted into the database, so if I'm getting an ID. Do I validate to see if that ID is valid? Nope. I come in, I check to see if there's anything in the database with that ID. If there's not, then I send back a not found, and it gets sent back as a 404. But other things to do for security, yeah, identity. I don't have that in here. Identity is very important. Yep, I would use JWT tokens. I use services like Okta or services like Auth0. They're one company now. So yeah. What about inheritance in models? You could do it. You could have a base. I mean, that's a very valid idea. Have a base entity that the two API models and the data entity models descend from, and then they can have whatever differences. Good idea, Alexandra. So great idea. Never thought about that, but you could do inheritance in your models and that. So very, very cool. That's great for audit attributions. Yep. So yeah. So maybe I'll add it, or you know what? This demo project is open sourced. It's anyone can give pull requests to it. I've had people. Can you please show the repository implementations? I will, because we're going to talk about the data layer now. So I appreciate you pushing me to talk about the data layer. Let's talk about the data layer. So it's where all the data lifting happens, everything around data. Everything is based on interfaces from the domain layer. We already looked at those. I use Entity Framework 5 for this demo, but I can use, like I said, I could use anything like Dapper or SQL JSON. We'll probably dig into EF Core, but I'll show you what the Dapper code looks like, and I'll show you what the SQL JSON code looks like. And then also I also mock up a data layer for testing. I didn't know the best picture for data, so I actually used my favorite form of data, which is the character from Next Generation, Star Trek Next Generation. And if we were in a big room, I would hear all you guys laughing. So I'm assuming, thank you, Drew, that everyone is chuckling and having a good time, because if you're old enough to remember Star Trek Next Generation, which I do remember, I was 16 when it came out, and I loved Star Trek as a kid. Actually, every Saturday night I watched Star Trek and Hee Haw as a kid back in the 70s. So it's one of my favorites, and I like Star Wars. So I like Star Trek and Star Wars evenly. So I am not a higher fan of either one. They're both great in my book. Okay, let's go out and take a look at the code for a data repository. So for EF Core, I do have my DB context out here because that is for EF Core. I keep it out here in this project. Data repository, it's pretty simple. It adheres to the iAlbum repository that's in my domain. I get the DB context from dependency injection. I actually use DB context pooling for my APIs. If you don't know about Entity Framework Core feature, it's been around for a couple versions, but it's called DB context pooling. And what it does is whenever you're grabbing a DB context from the dependency injection pool, it actually has a collection of DB contexts that were created at startup and that are around to be reused. They don't get created as they're being pulled out of the dependency injection pool. They're already created, and when they go back in the dependency injection pool, their state is wiped and they get put back into this collection. So it actually will save you, I have seen where it saves about 40% on performance, that there's so much overhead with creating these DB contexts every time that doing the pooling feature can save you a lot of time when you're calling your APIs. So look into that. So I do have a album exist. I just use the any. So in this case, the any async. This just sends back if the album exists in the database or not. DB context is already repository. Why do we need another? I don't understand what you're saying. The DB context is in the dependency, so I have to get it through dependency injection for these data repositories. So I do need it. It's not a repository. So because of the way that Entity Framework works. But so when I want to get all of my albums, I just go out and through that DB context, I get all of them. Pretty simple. There's not much to this code either, because it's isolated and just doing the data access functionality. So there's not much to any of this code as I decouple everything away from each other. Again, I build unit tests for each one of these. DB context manages the state of the object in the interface with the underlying data store. State of the object. Well, so remember, I don't really care about state in my web API. Now, state may be important for a web application, but state is nothing I'm worried about in a web API. A web API to me is a stateless application. So I don't really worry about the state of the object and the interface with the underlying data store. Yeah, it does have a configuration to know the underlying schema of your data store, the database, but you still have to have an object. You still have to have that hydrated and created, and the natural way to do it in since ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core have been around is to put your, and we'll go up and I'll show you how you do that, to put your DB context into the dependency injection. So that's why we have this add DB context pool, or you can just have add DB context. And this is what gets put into the dependency injection pool. So that's kind of the standard way of working with DB context, and that's why you kind of get the DB context from dependency injection, because it needs to be an object, and that object needs to know the connection string that that needs to have to connect to the to, in this case, SQL Server and the database inside SQL Server. It's an in state of the repository. Well, okay. Can you please show the code of iDisposable implementation? Don't have an iDisposable implementation. I just have a dispose on these iRepositories. So I don't really have a iDispose a special one. So they just get disposed in the garbage collection at the end. So whenever the GC goes through, whenever it goes through. So that is the entity framework. If you want to see what like Dapper looks like, basically it's the same thing. Dapper will get this DB info. So DB info is the all of the connection information that Dapper uses to connect to the data store or the database server. And so we get that DB info from dependency injection, and then we create that new connection, which is based on IDB connection. And basically, it's the same type of thing, just with the Dapper code. So Dapper uses this inline SQL to do its thing, because it's a little more down at the DB set level, and so that the interesting one, and some people don't like this, but I thought it was kind of interesting, was this idea for getting, there's a way to get JSON directly back from your database. And some people like it, some people don't, because it's basically static information, and it's not, you can't really do anything with it once you get it back. But, and so I created a number of stored procedures, and they're all in this SQL file that you can run against the database. Or, as you can see over here, I do have a bunch of routines. So each routine I can come up and say get album. So here's the stored procedure for get album. And if you don't like stored procedures, I understand some people don't like stored procedures, some people do. I grew up, when I first started in this industry, we used a lot of stored procedures. So I view them as, I use them when they're important to use, and I don't use them for certain things. So I love link and that whole feature, but sometimes for reporting purposes, I like using stored procedures to send back big result sets back for reports that I have to generate. But as an example, and for speed, yes, Todd. So in here, I just have this, you can send back, you can say select star from album for JSON path, and then you send back as a varchar max, and then you cast it as JSON data. And what that will send back is basically a result set with one field that contains all of your JSON. And if I come down here and I call that, let's call that get album, I call it, I fill it, and then I convert that, I deserialize and grab that data set where it's that 0 table and 0 row, and I can deserialize that and get back a list of albums. Now I could, in another way, just send back that JSON back to the endpoint and then have that come out. But I just wanted to see how this ran. It doesn't run very fast, so it's just kind of a fun exercise, but it does take the JSON, converts it back to a list of albums, and then I send that back out. So it's not great. Doesn't that get all albums? Where's a parameter in the Sprock? So in this case, this stored procedure doesn't take any parameters. If I want to get by ID, I have this get album details, which takes in one parameter called album ID, and it runs. And if you want to see what that stored procedure looks like, there it is. So it does take in your artist ID, and I just do the same select statement, but with a where clause on it. So, but Ashley, so the two stored procedures, very similar. One has a parameter and one doesn't. So to get all albums or to get one. So hope that answers your question. But that is my data layer, and I'm probably way over time. So I'm going to hurry up and get through the rest of this stuff. So let's move on and talk about caching. Caching to me is really important in my APIs. Because I never know how much distance there is between my web API project and where the database is. So I could have a web API okay, so I'm good on time. Awesome. So I could have my web API project running in a server farm on-premise in Orlando, Florida, and I could have my database in Los Angeles, California, or I could even have it in Australia. Now, the further away it is, the more latency there is between the two, in this case, the two servers. So caching would be important. So getting that information closer to where the code is would be important. If they were right next to each other, it's not as important, but I still think that caching as a idea is something to kind of look at and to think about where you need it and where you don't need it. So we'll talk about three types of caching. We'll talk about response caching, in-memory caching, and distributed caching. So response caching is not really a caching model for the server side. It's really a caching model for the consumer of the API. So it's part of the HTTP 1.1 specification. It's under the caching spec, and it directs the consumer to know if they can or cannot cache certain data coming back from your API endpoints. So let's take a look at how we tell a consumer that it is okay to cache on the consumer side. So we have this attribute called response cache, and we can put that on a controller or a controller action, and we can give it a duration. So this duration is I think the duration's actually in seconds. So we're saying in this that the data coming back from all the actions in this, if it's on the controller or in the action, if this response cache attribute is set on the action, the data coming back can be cached on the consumer side. And what happens is you get this response header called cache-control, and you get a max age on there. So the consumer sees that, it can cache it, but it doesn't have to. What you have to remember is this doesn't force the consumer to cache the data. It only caches it if it knows anything or reacts to that, to the inclusion of that response header in the HTTP response coming back. If it doesn't have any code or doesn't care about it, you're not going to get any of that data cached on the consumer side. One example is all the major browsers do adhere to this response header. So if you call an API from Chrome and to look at the JSON that is coming back, and this response header is in there, if you run that call again through the browser and it's within the duration of the max age for the data, the browser will not go out and call that API again. It will be smart enough to say, oh, this data is cached. I'm just going to give the data from the browser cache back into the browser window. So one thing, if you're building a consumer of APIs, think about looking at this and looking for this response header when you're building everything. So Dave, have a good time. Thanks for coming. But when you're building your consumer of your APIs, maybe it's a web application, or it's a mobile app, or it's a Blazor app, do think about and check to see if the API sends back these response headers. So if you don't want explicitly tell the consumer that the data coming back should not be cached, you can do a response cache, but you can say location is none, meaning do not store it anywhere on the consumer side, and don't store it. So it's saying don't store it and don't put it in any location. You have to do it kind of both of these, the location and the no store, for it to come back in this response header with this no store, no cache, and pragma no cache. So that way a browser, Chrome, will see this and say, oh, I won't store this, I won't cache this data because maybe it's very volatile, that the data changes constantly. So maybe it's stock prices, or maybe it's data around pricing, and the pricing of stuff changes all the time. Or maybe it's inventory and you don't want that inventory data stored. You want the consumer to constantly go out and get inventory numbers, because they do change quite regularly if you're in a high volatile business. So that's response caching. In-memory caching, I kind of showed you in the inside the demo. It was in the supervisor code. Very simple caching kind of techniques. You can get very advanced in using in-memory caching, but I was doing some very simple, easy ways to look at in-memory caching in my code. And then the third one is distributed caching. So I'm not going to read all this, but really it's when you're working in a server farm, if it's on-prem, or if you're working up in the cloud, you can use different, oh, you're welcome. You can use these different types of distributed caching. So local Redis cache, if you have a server farm and you have 20 different instances of your API on 20 different servers, and they're being used behind a and the name of the technology lost in my brain. But if you have 20 different servers doing this, you can have this local Redis cache behind them. Maybe you have one server that serves as the caching server, and all the different instances of your APIs server machines can go back and get cached, get the data cached on that load balancer. Thanks, Dave. You can also use SQL Server as a cache. So going back to my example of you have your API server farm in Orlando, your database is in Australia in a different part of the business. You can set up SQL Server to be a local cache for your API server farm that keeps that data closer than Australia. So SQL Server can be used as a distributed cache. And then for each one of the three cloud platforms, they each have their own product or features that serve for caching. So Azure has Redis cache, Amazon has Elasticache, and Google Cloud has Memcache. Now, the names of these may have changed because this is the name of these products a couple years ago. And knowing all these three cloud platforms, they change the name of their features quite often. So just look to see what the real caching name is for each one of these. But each one of the cloud platforms have their own distributed caching product, and they do cost money. They cost money for the size of the cache and also for putting and getting data back from the cache. So know that they will occur a cost. Testing. I have two types of testing. I have integration tests and unit tests. So integration testing is when you want to actually test from the outside. You actually test the API endpoints. And in this way, I kind of test them in a production type of manner. I want to see what the result is coming back from that API endpoint. And then the unit test is a normal unit test that we all know and love. And for me, right now, I'm unit testing the repositories and the supervisors. But if you do want to go out and know more about any of this stuff that I talked about in testing, do we have enough time for 5 minutes to look at integration testing, guys? I don't know how much time we have. Okay. So, but if you want to go out, I did a 3-part series back in 2018. It's out on Channel 9 if you do want to go find that. But let's go out and take a look at this, because when I first discovered integration tests, they kind of blew my mind. So I'm going to close all these tabs. I'll open up this, and there are some libraries that you need to, or some NuGet packages that you need to load up. You need to be able to have this test host and hosting. That's pretty much about it. I use XUnit for my unit tests. Integration testing uses the same framework that you build your unit tests, so it's very similar. It's very easy to wrap your brain around integration testing. The difference is what happens in the constructor. So I set up a test server based on, I can tell it what environment that I want it to be based on. So in this case, I'm just saying development. And then I give a startup. The startup is my startup class from my Chinook.api. So in this case, it actually creates a little web server that contains your web API. And then from there, the server, this little test server, can also create a client that knows all of the calls for your web APIs also. So you set up this little server and this little client, and you can set up tests based on those. So basically, you can create a new HTTP request message. So you have to give it the method, and that comes in from this inline data attribute. So it gets that message and then, or method, and then you have to know what the URI segment is to that you want to call. So in this case, I have it as /API/album, and this is the segment to get all my albums. And I get that request, I send it into the client, I get the response, and I can check it two ways. I can check to see, I can say if response ensures success status code, that will check to see if it's a 200 level, anything in the 200 range, and to see if that was successful. Or I can explicitly kind of say and use kind of the normal assert that we do in unit tests. So I can say assert equals, and I can say HTTP status code okay, and then I can check that against the response status code. So if I want to check it against a specialized response code like a 204 or a 206 or something else, I would use this assert equal to say explicitly what status code I am checking the response status code against. But you can, you don't have to do both of these at the same time. They're either one. I actually like this one because it's a little more explicit and I can get into a little more detail into my test. So really that's all that we're doing. So if I run these, and I'll come back here, I'm just going to run the integration tests. Come on, run selected. So if I run these, takes a second, they'll bring them all in and they should all pass. I haven't, yep, they're all successful. So as you can see, all of my integration tests are successful, and you can actually go down and see some of the details around those. So that's kind of what you can do. And all of these integration tests can actually also be put up into your CI/CD pipeline through with your DevOps work. So that is kind of cool, and it's kind of a cool feature to go beyond unit testing with your code. So if there's anything else to ask, please ask. I'll be around for a couple minutes, and here's my information, and I will also put the link. I will put the link out to my to this GitHub repository in 1 second. So GitHub. I'm grabbing that right now, but if anyone has questions, please ask them.
I have one around caching, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Is it, in your experience, is it easier to think about caching as you're designing your API before you need it, or put it in when you need it, when you're experiencing pain, I guess is the.
Yeah. I build it into my design. So I'll say, so we actually have what would be a good practice to mapping a verb if you had, for instance, a document object and you have multiple create operations. I'll get back with that in a second, Dave. But Tim, so caching should be thought about at the design level, at time that you're designing and you're building in these business requirements to say, hey, this call, this endpoint, does the data behind it, does it need to be cached or not? Because for me, if I'm building out the requirements for my web API, it gives my developers more information to do caching or not, and we don't have to retrofit those back in. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. So Dave, so good practice to verbs if you had, for instance, so all these actions, what you have to remember is you can build any of your controller actions to any verb that you want that is supported by HTTP. So you just create a new action based on merge, multiple create operations. So sometimes you can only have one post and you can only have one put. So it's unless you name them, you have different, you can, if
so
you,
well, for HTTP,
yeah, go ahead.
They always seem to want to create REST interfaces towards resources. So a document, pages, but when you have, when I want to create a document, there's multiple ways of creating it. And there's not really, that I've been able to find, a good practice, right? I mean, you could say, document, whack ID, whack, create, right? As the terminating endpoint.
Sure.
But it just seems like, I can't seem to find what a good practice would be around something like this, where there's multiple operations for like a verb.
Yeah, I mean, my thing is if I'm creating a new, well, so this is where REST and this idea of REST gets kind of fuzzy, because REST is not a defined architecture. So when Roy Felding wrote his dissertation, and REST was part of it, he didn't really define and say this is what REST is. He said this is the behavior of a RESTful use of the internet. So that's why there's a lot of back and forth on, is something REST, is something not REST. Now, I will say that if I am creating a new entity, I put that entity you put it into the request body, and I will send it over in a post. Now, for me, I don't want to get too complex, so so for you, there's this idea of clone. So a clone isn't really it's creating a new object, but it's really cloning it and basing another one on it, but you're not really sending in that document, right? You're probably sending in, hey, clone this ID and then give me back the JSON representation with the new ID associated with that cloned entity, is kind of what I'm hearing you say when I think clone. Now, split and merge, they're all different things. And yes, you can have different endpoints or different URI ends to kind of do those directives, those functions, and those could relate to different actions in your controllers on those entities. So I like your thinking, because yeah, you could have a clone, you could have split, you could have merge, but to me, those are just different actions and different URIs that you build after your or before. See, that's the thing too. Do you put those directives before your entities, or do you put them after? There's tons of different ways to do it. So
yeah, and like I said, I was just looking to see if maybe there was, I can't find anything that says this is what you should be doing, right? Or
well,
this is
that's
the
because
recommendation.
There is no right way to do anything. There's tons of people that do different implementations. So Andy, I love that you did a reference out to the Microsoft API guidelines. Those are awesome. So I agree with some of them, and I don't agree with some of them, but they are good guidelines that Microsoft uses when they build their APIs.
Yeah, I would say, and looking at yours, and I've been doing mobile and APIs for about as long as you have. So yeah, there's some things I like. Resource paths, I don't do that because it makes it harder to refit and all that. But
Yep.
But it does answer the question of once you go down the path of patches versus posts versus upsert versus all that, that at least stick to it and be consistent and try to get away from creating your own different methods onto different resources. Stick to the tried and true ones, and then just apply.
Because REST is resources. I mean, REST is kind of like when you do a REST call, it's kind of like a sentence. You have a noun, which is your resource. You have your verb, which is your verb, and then at the end you have a URL that you direct that the verb and the resource to. So, but everyone has their own opinion on all this stuff, and like I said, this is how I do it. Some people do it in different ways, and you know what? I'm always learning about other. I just read a document from, you guys know Micah Munson?
I know the name.
Yeah, so he speaks a lot. I would reach out to him and have him speak at. He has some awesome ideas about API design and stuff. But he had this article that that said that he doesn't use post anymore. Will not use post because post does not guarantee a response. Most of the time it gives a response, but it's not guaranteed. Like a get, and if you don't get a response back, what do? Do you send the post again and then potentially get that resource created over, like another resource copy get created? So
that's the whole item potency thing.
Yeah, like a get, if you don't get a response back from a get, who cares? I'll just call it again if it times out. Even an update and delete, you can call those as many times as you want. It's the post that will get you. Okay, Satosh, I'll see you at KCDC. So
yeah, thanks, Chris. See you soon. Bye.
Yep. So yeah, but for me, these ideas that I talk about, they're kind of basic, but the big one is like my API models having two sets of different models, so I can. Now that did come from the whole DDD, domain-driven development kind of side of the camp. So it's not full DDD, but I borrowed a little bit from it.
I guess I have a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's related to what you said about the class you teach on teaching HTTP. How do you get, so as a mobile developer who's worked with either done APIs or worked with developers of APIs, how do you get web developers to not think of sending everything as an object graph over the web, and then they wonder why their app is slow? Because HTTP REST is not set up. It's basically everything's a flat list or an object or a flat object or or a scalar or maybe a JSON, but it's not huge graphs. You don't send huge graphs over the web because that just slows everything down.
Yeah. You know what?
I think as API developers, we have to think about speed first.
Yeah.
Well, you have to think. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just think you're right. I think we really, I mean, we always think we can just spit this thing out and you can consume it however you need. But he's absolutely right. We do need to think about more of, let's just provide the minimum that's required and then allow the consumer to request more.
And that's how I build my APIs, yes.
Yeah, it's easy to fire hose it. It's harder to, like you said, and the one thing you said, I'm going to provide the artist name with the album. And I'm not going to provide the full artist details, just the name.
Yeah.
So and we have to get that.
And I got burned years ago. We were building a API and a mobile app, a Windows Phone app. So you know how old that is.
Oof, that's old.
We were building this for the MVP summit. We had an API around like parties and get-togethers and things that were not related to the Microsoft events, like events that individuals were putting on. And I built this app and the API, and someone said, well, why are you constantly going out to the API to get data over and over again? I go, well, because that's just the way I developed it. Us in America, that's awesome. We get unlimited data. But 10 years ago, Europe had to pay for all the data that they consumed across the internet, especially on their mobile devices. So that, and I also am very respectful for the size of my payloads coming back. So I have two things I think about: how fast I can get that data back out from my endpoint back to the consumer, and keeping that payload as small as possible because of bandwidth limitations. So, which is becoming less and less a thing now that we're getting into 4G and 5G and stuff. But when we were all in like 2G and 3G, I mean, if you sent back a huge JSON document inside of a HTTP response request, man, that could slow your whole application down. So Todd, I totally agree. It is something that you need to think about, and it goes back to what Tim was saying. You have to really think about your APIs at the design side. You need to think about a lot of different things around your APIs. Using cache, size of, like, trying to keep your payload size small, or do you set up different versions do you set up a mobile version of your API and a non-mobile version of your API? Sometimes that's the best way to do it. So. Did you mention microservices? Is that still a thing? Yeah, microservices are still a thing. So totally. I mean, I think it's different thing because you're really creating these little projects that just have one service. But you know what? If you live up in the cloud, you almost build those in AWS Lambdas or Azure Functions and be done with it. Because one, they're so cheap, and two, they're easy to set up.
Well, as you said, Azure Functions, Azure Functions is almost the closest thing to a regular REST API that you create with Web API in the Azure world. I mean, it's the only one that really relates to what I do, because it's basically the same thing, and I can put durable functions out there and have entities, and I don't even need a database for some projects, depending on what it is.
Yeah, you don't really. I mean, you could, or you could just pass that message on to something else to and not even worry about it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many. The world is so interesting now with Subhub and message passing and Kafka and enterprise service buses. Yeah, it's you can do. There's so many different ways to skin a cat nowadays.
Yeah.
Not that I tell people to skin cats, but probably not the most politically correct term anymore. So.
Is there any politically correct term?
Well, let's just say there's many different ways to wash a dog. So.
Dog washing. Oh my gosh, I'm offended.
But yeah. So now this is the way. I mean, I really, my API, this talk is for me fun because it just shares some ideas for people to go out and at least look at. Everyone has different ways to do things. I even like OData. So I was a big OData guy, and I still like OData for some things because I like the standard around it. I like that if I build an OData feed, that I don't have, that the person creating the consumer basically already knows everything they have to know to consume it. But that's also the great thing about having the Swagger docs or the API, open API docs now, is someone can grab your Swagger doc, run it through a generator, and at least have the start for your client, for the client code, for their JavaScript app or their C# app or their Rust or Go app or whatever Swagger, those generators support nowadays. Okay, well, it's almost my bedtime, so.
Oh, Chris, what I was going to tell you, that distillery, MB
Mhm.
Roland, it is just across it's very close to Fort Campbell. And actually the guy and it's actually really good. We went there 4 weeks ago. My son-in-law is stationed at Fort Campbell. So my daughter's
cool.
in Clarksville, and it's literally a 10-minute drive, but it's a neat little distillery. They only make about 190 bottles a day. But if you get a chance to get down there, really good whiskey, really good bourbon.
Yeah, nice. It's always good. Yeah, we're going back down in the spring, I think. So
nice.
My buddies and I, we usually either go to the Louisville side or Lexington side, but yeah, we go hunt for rare you can't find rare bottles anymore, really.
No.
There's so many people out there hunting bottles, but I just got an interesting one. If anyone knows Eddie Belfour, he was a NHL goalie. He's a Hall of Fame goalie.
Like Edmonton, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think so. But he has his own distillery now in Kentucky. Him and his family run it. And he has a new bourbon out that was aged, I think it's aged like 6 or 9 years in normal barrels, in white oak barrels, but it's finished for a year in Texas pecan wood barrels.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it has an awesome taste to it. So
well, there's one here. There's one at this place. It's got a smoked corn. It uses smoked corn, and when you sip it, and when you breathe out, you can taste the smoke, the smoky. It's really good. It's really good. Really?
No, sorry.
Oh, I loved it.
That big smoke. I'm
a pork smoker, things like that. So I really like that finish.
I like smoking drinks and cocktails, but I'm not a big Scotch ale fan, and I am not a smoked Scotch type of person. So
it was good though. I loved it. And they had a lemonade.
Well, hey, you can more for you, I guess.
They had a lemonade. Moonshine, basically lemonade moonshine. I tell you what, you would have to put that bottle up and not use it, because I tell you, you could drink that. It'd be like drinking lemonade, and you'd be 3 sheets to the wind in no time.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
Well, if you go to smoky there's a distillery in Pigeon Forge in Gatlinburg, Virginia. It's called Smoky something, and we bought tons of moonshine from there. They actually have a lemonade moonshine and a iced tea moonshine, and if you mix them together, is a Arnold Palmer moonshine. Yeah, yeah.
You got to watch those. You'll be hurting pretty quick.
Or they have moonshine that they put cherries into, like maraschino cherries.
Yeah.
And they're you can put them in drinks and stuff like that. So those are good. So but okay. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up. Yeah, if anyone needs to get a hold of me, they can find me on Twitter or send me an email. So I really appreciate everyone kind of having me. Just to let you know, this is the last virtual user group that I'm doing. So you guys, yeah, I'm taking August off and then gonna just do in-person conferences probably for the most part.
Excellent.
So.
Well, we appreciate having you. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate you.
Yeah, no problem, Tim. And is it Todd? I see J Todd, but you go by Todd or?
I go by Todd.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. And Andy, thank you. So hopefully I'll submit some talks to next year's Orlando Code Camp, and I'll see you guys down there next March. Okay.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks again.
Yeah, you too. I'll talk to everyone. Have a great rest of the summer and stay safe. Okay.
You too.
Bye.
All right. You too. Take care.